It was one of those perfect spring afternoons in the quiet neighborhood of Oak Ridge, where pristine lawns stretched out in front of million-dollar homes and luxury cars gleamed in circular driveways. Officer Richard Chen wasn't supposed to be patrolling this area. His usual beat was downtown, but a last-minute schedule swap had brought him to these tree-lined streets where nothing ever seemed to happen. Chen was new to the force, just 6 months in, and desperate to prove himself. His colleagues often joked that nothing exciting ever happened in Oak Ridge except for the occasional lost cat or noise complaint about someone's gardener starting too early in the morning. But Chen was determined to show everyone that he could spot trouble wherever it lurked. That's when he noticed her, a young black girl walking alone on the sidewalk, carrying what looked like a stack of books. She wore a bright blue backpack that seemed too new for the somewhat wrinkled school uniform she had on. Something about the scene didn't sit right with Chen. In his mind, he started ticking off boxes. Unfamiliar face, probably didn't live in the area, walking alone in an affluent neighborhood. The girl was taking her time, occasionally shifting the weight of the books in her arms, completely absorbed in her own world. She hummed softly to herself, practiced notes from her upcoming choir performance floating through the warm afternoon air. Her small silver watch, a birthday gift from her grandmother, caught the sunlight as she adjusted her grip on the books once again. Chen slowed his patrol car, tracking her movement. He watched as she stopped to admire Mrs. Henderson's prize-winning rose garden, the same way she did every Tuesday after her library visits. But Chen didn't know this was her routine. He didn't know that she could name every neighbor's dog on the street, or that she had helped plant some of those very roses during the community gardening day last spring. The more Officer Chen watched, the more convinced he became that something was off. His training academy lessons echoed in his head. Trust your instincts. Better to check and be wrong than ignore a potential situation. What he conveniently forgot was the other half of that lesson about community policing and avoiding bias-based assumptions. He pulled his patrol car alongside the curb, the action smooth and practiced. The girl didn't notice at first, still lost in thought about the history project she'd been researching at the library. The books in her arms were heavy with information about the civil rights movement, her chosen topic for the semester. Inside his car, Chen ran through his mental checklist. He'd make this quick and professional. If everything checked out, no harm done. If something was wrong, he'd have caught a potential criminal. The thought of praise from his superiors made his chest swell with anticipation. The girl finally noticed the police car when Chen opened his door, the creak of metal breaking through her daydreams. She slowed her pace, clutching her books closer to her chest. Her mother had talked to her about moments like this. Stay calm, be respectful, remember you have rights, but also remember that sometimes being right isn't enough to keep you safe. The spring breeze carried the scent of those roses she'd been admiring, but she barely noticed now. Her heart began to race as Officer Chen's footsteps approached from behind. She could feel her phone buzzing in her pocket, probably her dad checking where she was. Any other day, she would have grabbed it immediately, but right now her arms felt frozen around her books. "Excuse me, young lady," Chen called out, his voice carrying that artificial authority that new officers often adopt. "I'm going to need you to stop right there." The girl turned slowly, her mind racing through everything she knew about her rights, everything her parents had taught her, every conversation they'd had about existing in spaces where some people might think you don't belong. She opened her mouth to explain that she lived just 3 houses down, that her father was, but looking at Officer Chen's face, she realized with a sinking feeling that this afternoon was about to become much longer than she'd planned. The sun continued to shine cheerfully overhead, oblivious to the situation unfolding below, as another example of prejudice and power was about to play out on the peaceful streets of Oak Ridge. "I need to see some ID," Officer Chen demanded, standing uncomfortably close to the young girl. His hand rested on his belt, a habit he picked up during training that he thought made him look more authoritative. The books in her arms were getting heavier by the second, but she didn't dare move to set them down. "I'm only 12, sir," she replied softly, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "I don't have an ID yet, but I live right there." She tried to point with her elbow towards a beautiful two-story house with white pillars and a wraparound porch, but the movement caused her top book to slip. She quickly readjusted, catching it before it fell. Officer Chen's eyes narrowed. He'd heard every excuse in the book during his short time on the force, and he wasn't about to let a potential suspect sweet-talk their way out of this. "Put the books down slowly and keep your hands where I can see them," he ordered, his voice getting louder as a couple of neighbors began peering out their windows. Mrs. Wu, who was watering her prized hydrangeas, stopped mid-spray. She'd known the girl since she was in diapers, had watched her grow up on this very street. "Officer," she called out, taking a step forward. "There must be some mistake. She's—" "Ma'am, please stay back," Chen cut her off sharply. "This is police business." His authoritative tone made Mrs. Wu flinch, but she didn't move away. Instead, she pulled out her phone and started typing frantically. The girl carefully placed her books on the ground, her hands trembling slightly. The top book fell open to a page about peaceful protests in the 1960s, an irony that wasn't lost on her. She thought about all the times her father had talked about building bridges between the police and the community, about making people feel protected rather than threatened. Right now, those words seemed very far away. More neighbors were emerging from their homes now. Mr. Rodriguez from across the street was walking his dog and stopped in his tracks. Old Mrs. Thompson, who always gave out the best Halloween candy, watched from her porch with her hand over her mouth. The girl could hear whispers, could feel the tension building in the air like before a summer storm. "Turn around and put your hands behind your back," Officer Chen commanded, reaching for his handcuffs. His own heart was beating faster now. This was his first real arrest, and he was determined to do everything by the book. He didn't notice how the neighbors were shaking their heads, didn't see the looks of disbelief and anger on their faces. "Please," the girl said, her voice cracking slightly. "My dad is—" "You can explain everything down at the station," Chen interrupted, the cold metal of the handcuffs clicking into place around her small wrists. The sound seemed to echo through the quiet street, making several onlookers gasp. Mr. Rodriguez had seen enough. "This is ridiculous," he shouted, pulling out his phone. "She's just a kid walking home from the library." His dog barked in agreement, sensing the tension in his owner's voice. But Officer Chen was too far committed now. He'd made his decision, and backing down would mean admitting he'd made a mistake. Instead, he began reciting the Miranda rights, his voice carrying across the manicured lawns as he guided the girl toward his patrol car. The girl caught a glimpse of her reflection in the car's window. Her school uniform neat and pressed as always, the blue backpack her grandmother had given her for her birthday, and now, impossibly, handcuffs around her wrists. A tear rolled down her cheek, but she held her head high, just like her parents had taught her. As Chen opened the back door of his patrol car, Mrs. Wu's frantic typing finally paid off. Her message had been sent, and several phones in the neighborhood buzzed simultaneously. The wheels of justice were already turning, though Officer Chen didn't know it yet. In just a few minutes, his whole world was about to change, but for now, he was focused on following procedure, on doing what he thought was right, on proving himself, while making the biggest mistake of his career. The crowd on the street was growing larger by the minute. Officer Chen could feel the weight of their stares as he radioed in his report. "Dispatch, I have one juvenile subject in custody, suspected of suspicious activity in the Oak Ridge area." His voice cracked slightly on the word suspicious, as if even he was starting to doubt himself. In the back of the patrol car, the girl sat quietly, her hands still cuffed behind her. The leather seat felt cold through her uniform skirt, and the partition between the front and back seats made the space feel even smaller. She could see her books scattered on the sidewalk where she'd been forced to drop them. A gentle breeze flipped through the pages of her history textbook, almost mockingly. Mrs. Wu was now on her third phone call, pacing back and forth on her lawn. Yes, right now. They have her in the back of a police car, she was saying, her voice rising with each word. Someone needs to get here immediately. Her normally perfectly styled hair was coming loose as she gestured frantically with her free hand. Mr. Rodriguez had started recording everything on his phone, maintaining a running commentary. "This is what happens in our neighborhood now," he said to his camera. "A young girl walking home from the library gets treated like a criminal. She's lived here her whole life." His usually friendly golden retriever stood guard beside him, still growling softly at Officer Chen. More neighbors were arriving on the scene. The Peters family had come running from 3 houses down, still in their gardening clothes. Old Mrs. Thompson had called her daughter, who was a lawyer. Even the teenage boys who usually stayed glued to their video games had come outside to see what was happening. Officer Chen tried to maintain his professional demeanor, but sweat was beginning to form on his forehead. He hadn't expected this level of neighborhood response. In his training, they'd talked about crowd control, but this was different. These weren't angry protesters. These were concerned residents in one of the city's most upscale neighborhoods, all telling him he was making a terrible mistake. Inside the patrol car, the girl closed her eyes and took deep breaths, just like her mom had taught her when she felt overwhelmed. Through the car's window, she could hear snippets of conversation from the growing crowd. Officer Chen was now standing by his car door, one hand on his radio, trying to look authoritative while clearly becoming more uncertain by the second. He'd started this situation thinking he'd catch a suspicious person, maybe even earn some praise from his superiors. Now he was facing an increasingly hostile crowd of well-connected residents, all unified in their support of his young suspect. The sound of another police siren in the distance made everyone turn their heads. Officer Chen felt a small surge of relief. Backup was coming. Finally, someone to help him control this situation. What he didn't know was that the approaching siren belonged to a vehicle he really didn't want to see. Mrs. Wu suddenly stopped her pacing and broke into a wide smile. "Oh, thank goodness," she said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Now we'll see some real justice." The girl in the back seat heard the siren too, and for the first time since this nightmare began, she allowed herself a small smile. She recognized that particular siren sound. She'd heard it enough times in her driveway. Through the window, she could see Officer Chen standing straighter, preparing to explain the situation to his backup. The neighbors had gone quiet, all eyes fixed on the corner where the siren was getting louder. Even the birds seemed to have stopped chirping, as if nature itself was waiting to see what would happen next. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the perfect lawns of Oak Ridge, and Officer Chen was about to learn a lesson he'd never forget. The police chief was in the middle of a budget meeting when his phone buzzed for the 3rd time. Usually, he'd ignore it, but something made him glance down. 3 messages from different neighbors on his street caught his eye. His heart skipped a beat when he read the first one. "Your daughter is being arrested in front of your house." He stood up so quickly his chair rolled back and hit the wall. "Meeting's over," he announced, already heading for the door. The other officers in the room exchanged confused looks. Their chief had never ended a meeting abruptly in his 15 years of service. Racing down to his car, he tried calling his daughter's phone. No answer. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as he sped through the city streets, lights and siren blaring. In his 25 years on the force, he'd handled hostage situations, gang shootouts, and major drug busts, but nothing had ever made his heart race like this. As he turned onto his street, the scene came into view. His first thought was that it looked like a block party, except nobody was smiling. Neighbors stood in clusters on their perfectly manicured lawns, many holding up phones, all focused on a police car parked in front of his house. Through his windshield, he could see Mrs. Wu, still in her gardening hat, practically jumping up and down as his car approached. Mr. Rodriguez had his loyal dog by his side, both looking equally upset. And there, in the middle of it all, was a young officer he vaguely recognized from recent hiring, standing beside his patrol car like he was posing for a training manual photo. The chief's car came to a stop about 20 feet from the scene. He stepped out slowly, his uniform pristine, his badge catching the afternoon sun. The crowd parted like the Red Sea, creating a clear path between him and Officer Chen. The only sound was the tick-tick-tick of his car's engine cooling down. Officer Chen's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, recognition, and then pure horror as realization dawned. The chief walked forward with measured steps, each footfall seeming to echo in the unusual silence that had fallen over the street. Even the birds seemed to have stopped chirping. "Officer Chen," the chief said quietly, his voice carrying clearly in the still air. "Would you care to explain why there's a young girl in handcuffs in the back of your patrol car?" His tone was calm, but anyone who knew him could hear the storm brewing underneath. Chen's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. "Sir, I was responding to suspicious activity in the neighborhood." His voice trailed off as he watched his boss walk past him and open the back door of the patrol car. The chief's heart clenched when he saw his daughter sitting there, hands cuffed behind her back, tear tracks on her cheeks, but her head held high. Just like her mother, he thought, dignified even in the worst situations. "Daddy," she whispered, and suddenly she was just his little girl again, the one who used to ride on his shoulders during the neighborhood block parties, who helped him wash his car every Sunday, who wanted to be a judge when she grew up, to help make things fair for everyone. The crowd watched in complete silence as the chief gently helped his daughter out of the car. Officer Chen had begun to shake slightly, the gravity of his mistake finally hitting him full force. He'd arrested the police chief's daughter, but more than that, he'd arrested an innocent 12-year-old girl who had simply been walking home from the library. The sound of a key unlocking the handcuffs seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet street. As they fell away, the chief rubbed his daughter's wrists gently, checking for marks. The simple gesture, so fatherly and concerned, made several neighbors dab at their eyes. Mrs. Wu had already gathered the scattered books from the sidewalk, hugging them to her chest like precious things. The chief's daughter would get them back soon, but right now, her father wasn't letting go of her hands, and she wasn't letting go of his. The chief turned back to Officer Chen, who looked like he wanted the ground to open up and swallow him whole. The next few minutes would change not just Chen's career, but the entire department's approach to community policing. Sometimes, the hardest lessons come from the simplest situations, and this lesson was about to begin. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife as the police chief stood facing Officer Chen. The young officer's earlier confidence had completely evaporated, replaced by the look of someone who knew their career was hanging by a thread. Sweat trickled down his temple despite the cool spring breeze. "Your badge and gun, Officer Chen," the chief said quietly. His voice was calm, but it carried the weight of 2 decades of command. He kept one arm protectively around his daughter's shoulders as he held out his other hand expectantly. The gathered neighbors watched in complete silence as Chen's trembling fingers fumbled with his belt. The badge made a soft clinking sound as he placed it in the chief's outstretched palm. The gun followed, carefully handled despite his shaking hands. I was just following protocol, sir," Chen stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. She matched the description of. He trailed off, realizing how hollow his excuses sounded. What description? There hadn't been any calls. No reports of suspicious activity. Just his own assumptions and prejudices laid bare for everyone to see. The chief looked at the badge in his hand, then back at Chen. "Protocol," he repeated, his voice taking on an edge that made several onlookers shiver. "Show me where in the protocol it says to handcuff a 12-year-old girl walking home from the library. Show me where it says to ignore multiple citizens vouching for her identity. Show me where it says to let bias cloud your judgment. Mrs. Wu stepped forward, still clutching the girl's library books. Chief, she said softly, she comes this way every Tuesday. Has been for years. We all know her. She helps me with my roses. Her voice cracked slightly at the end, and her husband gently placed a hand on her shoulder. Mr. Rodriguez's dog had finally stopped growling and sat quietly at his feet, as if he too was witnessing a moment of justice unfolding. The teenager who had been recording everything was still holding up his phone, but his hands were shaking slightly. Dad, the chief's daughter spoke up, her voice stronger now. Can I show Officer Chen something? When her father nodded, she walked over to where her books lay in Mrs. Wu's arms. She selected one, a thick volume about civil rights history, and opened it to a chapter she'd been reading earlier. I was studying this for my history project, she explained, holding the book so Chen could see it. It's about how small actions can lead to big changes, how one person standing up, or not standing up, can affect an entire community. Her voice was clear and steady, showing a maturity far beyond her years. Chen looked at the book, then at the girl, then at the ground. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on anyone present. Here was a young girl, studying the history of civil rights, becoming a living example of why that history still mattered today. The chief watched his daughter with a mixture of pride and pain. She was handling this with such grace, but no child should have to be this composed after being handcuffed and put in the back of a police car for simply existing in their own neighborhood. Officer Chen, the chief said, drawing everyone's attention back to him. You're suspended, effective immediately. Report to Internal Affairs tomorrow morning at 9 a.m., he paused, looking around at the gathered neighbors, his community, his daughter's protectors. This incident will be thoroughly investigated and appropriate actions will be taken. A collective murmur of approval went through the crowd. Old Mrs. Thompson nodded firmly from her porch. The Peters family exchanged satisfied looks. Even the usually quiet mailman, who had stopped his rounds to watch the scene unfold, gave a small nod of approval. Chen stood there, stripped of his badge and gun, looking suddenly very young and very lost. He opened his mouth as if to say something more, then closed it again. What could he say? How could he explain away actions that had no justification? The afternoon sun was starting to cast long shadows across the street, but no one moved to leave. They all knew they were witnessing something important, a moment when justice wasn't just an abstract concept in a textbook, but a real, living thing happening right in front of them. And tomorrow, things would begin to change, not just for Officer Chen, but for the entire department. Back at police headquarters, the chief's office had become the center of intense activity. The sun was setting outside his window, casting an orange glow across the room where senior officers had gathered for an emergency meeting. The incident with Officer Chen had sparked something that couldn't be ignored. I want every piece of body camera footage from today, the chief commanded, his voice firm but controlled. His daughter was safe at home with her mother now, but the memory of seeing her in handcuffs kept flashing through his mind. Every second, every angle, every word spoken. The department's training coordinator, a veteran officer with salt and pepper hair, was reviewing Chen's file on his tablet. He graduated from the academy 6 months ago, she reported, shaking her head. High scores in tactical training, but his community engagement evaluations were concerning. On the wall-mounted screen, they watched the footage from Chen's body camera. The chief's knuckles turned white as he gripped his chair, watching his daughter trying to explain who she was, seeing how Chen had dismissed the neighbor's attempts to intervene. The other officers in the room shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Stop the video, the chief ordered suddenly. He stood up and walked to the window, looking out over the city he'd sworn to protect. This isn't just about one officer making a bad decision. This is about a system that made him think that decision was acceptable. The room fell silent. They all knew he was right. Chen's actions weren't born in a vacuum. They were the result of ingrained biases, incomplete training, and a culture that sometimes valued authority over understanding. "Sir," spoke up the community relations officer, a woman who'd spent 20 years building bridges between the police and the public. "Maybe we can use this, not just to punish Officer Chen, but to make real changes. Your daughter's experience, with your permission, could be a powerful teaching tool." The chief turned back to face his team. The setting sun behind him cast his shadow long across the office floor. "My daughter spent 15 minutes in handcuffs today because she was walking home from the library while being black. In her own neighborhood. Outside her own house." His voice was steady, but carried the weight of both personal pain and professional responsibility. One of the senior surgeons cleared his throat. "Chief, the press is already calling. Social media is blowing up with videos from the neighbors. We need to get ahead of this." "No," the chief replied firmly. "We need to get it right. This isn't about public relations. This is about fundamental change." He walked back to his desk and pressed the intercom button. "Send in Officer Chen." A few minutes later, Chen entered the office. He changed into civilian clothes, and without his uniform and badge, he looked younger and more vulnerable. The confident officer from earlier that day was gone, replaced by someone who seemed to be carrying the weight of his actions on his shoulders. "Sit down, Chen," the chief instructed, gesturing to a chair in the center of the room. All eyes turned to the young officer as he lowered himself into the seat. "I want you to watch your body camera footage, and then I want you to tell us exactly what you were thinking at each moment." As the video began playing again, Chen's face went through a range of emotions: defensiveness, shame, realization. When it reached the part where the chief's daughter tried to explain that she lived there, Chen looked away, but the chief's voice cut through the room. "No, you watch every second of what you did." The sun had fully set now, and the office lights cast a harsh fluorescent glow over the scene. Outside, the city was coming alive with evening activities. Families having dinner, kids finishing homework, people living their normal lives. But in this room, a moment of reckoning was taking place that would change not just one officer's career, but an entire department's approach to serving and protecting their community. The video continued playing, a stark reminder that sometimes the biggest lessons come from the smallest moments, and that real change often begins with the courage to face our mistakes head-on. The department's largest conference room was packed the next morning. Officers from every precinct sat shoulder to shoulder, their usual chatter replaced by an unusual silence. The chief stood at the podium, his presence commanding attention without saying a word. Behind him, a large screen displayed a still image from Chen's body camera footage. "What you're about to see," the chief began, his voice carrying to every corner of the room, "is not just a training video. This is my daughter. This is our community. This is everything we're doing wrong and everything we need to fix." He pressed a button, and the video began to play. The room watched in complete silence as the events unfolded on screen. Some officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Others took notes. A few older veterans shook their heads, recognizing mistakes they might have made themselves years ago. When the video ended, the chief didn't speak immediately. He let the silence hang in the air, letting every officer feel the weight of what they'd just witnessed. In the back of the room, Officer Chen sat alone, required to attend as part of his disciplinary action. "Yesterday," the chief continued, "we failed. Not just Officer Chen, all of us. We failed because somewhere along the line, we created a culture where a 12-year-old girl couldn't walk home from the library without being treated like a criminal in her own neighborhood." A senior officer raised her hand. "Sir, what about our existing racial sensitivity training?" The chief picked up a thick manual from the podium. "This," he held it up for everyone to see. "This isn't enough. Reading about bias in a manual is one thing. Seeing its impact on a real child, that's different." He set the manual down with a purposeful thud. From his seat, Chen spoke up, his voice slightly shaky but determined. "Chief, may I say something?" After receiving a nod, he stood up, facing his colleagues. "Yesterday, I thought I was doing my job. I was wrong. I wasn't protecting or serving anyone. I was just afraid. Afraid of making a mistake by not acting, when the real mistake was acting based on fear and bias." The room stayed quiet, but the atmosphere had shifted. This wasn't just another mandatory training session. This was real, raw, and personal. The chief clicked to the next slide, showing the faces of community members who had tried to intervene. These people knew my daughter. They tried to tell Officer Chen he was making a mistake, but he was so focused on proving his authority that he couldn't hear them. That stops today. He outlined the new changes: expanded community engagement programs, regular neighborhood walks for officers, partnerships with local schools, and a complete overhaul of the department's approach to suspicious person calls. Starting next week, he announced, every officer will spend time with community leaders, learning their stories, understanding their perspectives. You'll have dinner with families, attend local events, and become part of the neighborhood you serve. A young officer in the front row raised her hand. "But sir, what about our regular duties, our response times?" The chief smiled for the first time that morning. "What do you think will happen to crime rates when people trust their police officers? When kids don't run away at the sight of a patrol car? When elderly residents feel comfortable calling us for help?" He clicked to the final slide, a picture of his daughter's scattered library books on the sidewalk. My daughter was studying the civil rights movement when she was handcuffed. She was learning about how small actions can lead to big changes. Well, this is our moment for change. The energy in the room had transformed. Officers were sitting straighter, many nodding in agreement. Even Chen, still in his seat at the back, had a look of determination replacing his earlier shame. "This isn't just about one incident or one officer," the chief concluded. "This is about who we are and who we want to be. Every person in this room has the power to make a difference. The question is, what difference will you choose to make?" As the meeting ended and officers filed out, many stopped to look at the community engagement sign-up sheets by the door. Real change was beginning, sparked by one afternoon, one mistake, and one department's determination to do better. 1 month had passed since the incident, and the changes in the Oak Ridge neighborhood were impossible to miss. On this particular sunny Saturday morning, the local community center buzzed with activity. The parking lot was filled with both police cars and civilian vehicles, but not because of any emergency. Inside, officers in casual uniforms sat at round tables with local residents, sharing coffee and conversation. The chief's daughter stood at a podium, her voice clear and confident as she addressed the mixed crowd of police officers and community members. "A month ago, I was handcuffed outside my own house," she began, holding up her library card. "Today, I'm helping launch our new community safety program." The room fell silent, everyone leaning in to listen. Even the usual whispers and coffee cup clinks stopped. In the back of the room sat Officer Chen, no longer in uniform, but still part of the process. After his suspension and retraining, he requested to be part of the community outreach team. Today, he was helping coordinate the new Neighborhood Watch program, working alongside the very residents who had witnessed his biggest mistake. "When I was put in those handcuffs," the young girl continued, "I was scared. But what happened next showed me something important. I saw my neighbors stand up for what was right. I saw police officers, including my dad, admit that things needed to change. And I saw that when we work together, we can make those changes happen." Mrs. Wu, sitting in the front row, wiped a tear from her eye. Next to her, Mr. Rodriguez nodded approvingly, his faithful dog sleeping peacefully under the table. The room was filled with familiar faces from that day, but now they wore expressions of hope rather than anger. The chief stood up to join his daughter at the podium. "In the past month," he announced, "we've made real changes. Our officers have attended 30 community dinners. We've started a youth mentorship program, and most importantly, we've learned to listen." He gestured to a wall covered with photographs. Officers playing basketball with local kids, helping elderly residents with groceries, attending neighborhood barbecues. These weren't staged photo ops, they were genuine moments of connection. But the biggest change, the chief continued, is in how we think about our role. We're not just here to enforce laws. We're here to be part of this community. He paused, looking at his daughter with pride. Sometimes it takes a child to teach us the most important lessons. Officer Chen raised his hand and was acknowledged. He stood, his posture different from the uncertain rookie of a month ago. "I want to share something," he said, his voice steady. "That day changed me. I thought being a good police officer meant being tough and suspicious. Now I know it means being part of something bigger than yourself." The room erupted in supportive applause. Mrs. Wu walked over and patted Chen's shoulder. The same woman who had frantically called the chief a month ago was now showing forgiveness and support. The chief's daughter returned to the podium. "We're calling this new program Bridge the Gap," she explained. "Because that's what we're doing. Building bridges between police and community, between fear and understanding, between what we were and what we can be." She held up a thick folder. "These are the new guidelines we created together. Officers and residents worked on these as a team. They're not just rules, they're promises we make to each other." The morning sun streamed through the community center windows, casting warm light across the diverse faces in the room. On one wall hung a framed photo from that fateful day, not to remind people of the pain, but to show how far they'd come. As the meeting concluded, people didn't rush to leave. Officers and residents mingled, discussing plans for the upcoming community festival. Kids ran between tables, no longer seeing uniforms as something to fear. Even the local ice cream shop owner had set up a small stand, giving out free scoops to celebrate the day. Outside, a new sign was being installed in front of the community center. "Together, we make our communities safer." It wasn't just a slogan, it was a promise being fulfilled, one relationship at a time. 1 year after the incident, the Oak Ridge neighborhood had become a model for police-community relations across the country. News vans lined the streets outside the newly renovated police station, where reporters gathered to cover the launch of what everyone now called the Library Card Initiative. The chief's daughter, now 13 and even more poised than before, stood beside her father at the podium. The room was packed with familiar faces: Mrs. Wu, still tending her roses, but now also leading community safety workshops; Mr. Rodriguez, whose dog had become the unofficial mascot of neighborhood patrol meetings; and even Officer Chen, who had transformed from a rookie's cautionary tale into a passionate advocate for change. A year ago, the chief began, his voice carrying across the hushed room, "My daughter was handcuffed for walking home with library books." Today, those same library books have inspired a nationwide program. He gestured to the wall behind him, where hundreds of photos showed similar community transformation stories from across the country. His daughter stepped forward, holding up a new type of card. Half library card, half community ID. "This simple card," she explained, "is changing how police and communities work together. Every officer now spends time in our libraries, reading with kids, helping with homework, and being part of our neighborhood. When I see officers in the library now, they're not looking for suspicious activity. They're looking for ways to help." The statistics displayed on the screen told a powerful story. Community trust in police had increased by 85%. Crime rates had dropped by 40%. But more importantly, there hadn't been a single incident of wrongful detention in the past year. Officer Chen, now a community relations trainer, shared his perspective. "I carry my mistake with me every day," he said, standing tall in his reformed role. "But I also carry the lessons it taught me. Now, when I train new officers, I tell them that true strength isn't about authority. It's about understanding." The cameras flashed as the chief unveiled the new police department motto: "Protect, serve, understand. It wasn't just words on a wall, it was a philosophy that had transformed an entire community. Mrs. Wu stepped up to share her story. Last week, she said, smiling, I saw two young officers helping a group of kids with their science projects at the library. A year ago, I was calling the chief in panic. Now, I'm inviting officers to my garden club meetings. The chief's daughter had started a youth advisory council, where young people regularly met with police officers to discuss their concerns and ideas. Her history project about civil rights had evolved into a curriculum now used in police academies nationwide. But the real change, she said, looking around the room, isn't in the programs or the statistics. It's in the small moments. When kids wave at police cars instead of hiding from them. When officers know the names of the people on their beat. When a routine patrol feels more like visiting friends. The room erupted in applause as she held up her original library books from that day. They had become symbols of transformation, reminding everyone that positive change often comes from the most unexpected moments. As the ceremony concluded, the doors opened to reveal a street festival in full swing. Officers and residents mingled freely, sharing food and stories. Children played safely under the watchful eyes of a community that had learned to work together. The chief watched it all with quiet satisfaction, his daughter by his side. What had started as a terrible mistake had blossomed into something remarkable. A true partnership between police and community, a model of what was possible when people chose understanding over fear. And there, in the heart of Oak Ridge, where a young girl had once been handcuffed for walking home with books, a new generation was growing up, knowing that their police officers weren't just law enforcers. They were neighbors, mentors, and friends. The library card initiative would spread to other cities, but its heart would always be here, where a single incident had sparked a revolution in community policing. As the sun set on another peaceful day in Oak Ridge, the message was clear. Sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest moments, and it's never too late to learn, to grow, and to build a better community together.